Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell here with my thoughts on Antebellum, which was one of 2020's most anticipated films at one point, then delayed its release due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and was eventually released on video on demand just yesterday. Before I get into my thoughts on the movie, I just wanted to let you know about a new show that I just started over on the Schmodown Entertainment Network. It is both on YouTube and available as a podcast on Apple and Spotify and wherever podcasts are available. I am very excited about all my movies. It is a really fun project that I've been wanting to get off the ground for a long time. The basic premise of it is that I go through my movie collection, my physical movie collection, movie by movie, both by myself and with special guests. I'd really love for you to check it out. As I mentioned, there's some links down in the description below where you can find the show, also on the Schmodown Entertainment Network and on Apple Podcasts. I'd love to have you as part of the show. Antebellum is the feature writing and directing debut of co-directors Gerard Bush and Christopher Renz and stars Janelle Monae in what I think is a really solid performance. In two roles, we see her as Vanessa, who is a successful Black author attempting to navigate the hopeful end of generations of oppression for African Americans, and we see her as Eden, who is a slave who's being treated brutally on a Civil War era plantation. And as you may have seen from the trailers and from other promotional materials, their two lives intersect in ways that are very spoilery that I'm not going to get into right now. So I won't spoil the movie. Suffice it to say that the movie does hinge on a connection between these two characters. In addition to Janelle Monae in the lead role, there is a really talented supporting cast in this film, including Kiersey Clemons, Gabourey Sidibe, Eric Lang, Jenna Malone, and Jack Houston. And there's a lot of mystery going on with this film. There's a lot of trying to guess because you start out in one era, you go to another era, and then you find out what connects these two eras as we end the film and what connects these two characters. And so it's kind of hard to talk about the movie without going into that too much. But what I will say is that it's a movie that has a lot to say. And it says it not very subtly at times. You're not going to be walking out of the theater wondering, or sitting at home, I guess, right now on your couch, wondering what the point of the movie was. And that would be the biggest negative for me in the category for this film, is that it is not subtle about what it is saying and what it is doing. But there are also a lot of really strong positives to speak of in favor for this movie. One of them is, as I mentioned, not just Janelle Monae's lead performance, but that supporting cast is really, really strong. Some of them in bigger roles, some of them in smaller roles. This is the biggest role I've seen in a while for Gabourey Sidibe, and she was a real breath of fresh air in this movie and brings a lot of airiness and light to the scenes that she's in. Jenna Malone, also a standout for me. We see her in a couple of different lights in this film, and she's a character that you're not really sure what's going on with her until the curtain is revealed and you see what this movie is actually about and what's really going on. So the performances are definitely a plus in the plus column for this movie. The cinematography by Pedro Luque Brizzo is gorgeous. This is a beautiful looking film. The movie opens with a shot that appears to be several minutes long. I think there might have been one edit, but it's very artfully hidden. But either way, it's a very impressive shot that sort of establishes the world where we are on this Civil War era plantation. And it's a beautiful piece of cinematography, and the whole film it really does look beautiful. So from a technical aspect, I think this film is really well made. From a performance aspect, I think the performances in this film are really strong. And really, it ultimately rests on the centerpiece performance from Janelle Monae. And she's asked to do a lot of different things. You're asked to look at the characters that she inhabits in different ways, and then you recontextualize a lot of that if you were to go back and see the movie a second time, or if you're thinking back to earlier parts of the movie. And you have to be able to play that very well. It's not just a trick of editing. You have to know as an actor what notes to play and where you are in the film. And Janelle Monae does a really, really good job of that in this film. And I think ultimately the film doesn't work if her performance isn't really strong. Her performance, however, is. And the film as a whole did work for me. I do think, as I mentioned, the big detractor is that there are times where this film seems really on the nose. And there are times where I think that that's valid, but there are other times where I think you look at what's going on in the movie and you say, is this the real world reflecting the movie, or is this the movie reflecting the real world? Because as I mentioned, this movie was supposed to come out in April of 2020. The shooting began over a year ago, back in May of 2019. And looking at the film at the end of it, and looking back on the parts of it that I thought was in my head, I was like, oh, well, that's kind of obvious. Like, that's really on the nose. There was some stuff, references to things that hadn't happened when this movie was shot at the same volume and at the same intensity that they are right now. So in a way, they almost were predating real world events. And so I eased off a little bit on my thoughts on how the messaging in this film is handled. Although, again, I will say that it's not incredibly subtle. But one thing that I did do, and this is very rare for me when I'm reviewing a new movie, is the embargo on this movie dropped a couple weeks ago. I didn't get a chance to see it until I rented it yesterday and watched it. But I did notice, particularly because, like I said, this was a very anticipated film. I did notice that it seemed like the reviews for it were not just mixed, but were quite negative. And so after I watched the movie and processed my thoughts and prepared for this review yesterday, I sat down to read some of the other criticism of this movie, because while I didn't think that it was a wonderful movie, one of the year's best, I did, in a general sense, enjoy more of the movie than I didn't enjoy. And so I'm always curious about why someone else might have a different reaction to this movie than I did. One thing that I saw repeated over and over was that a lot of people felt that this was in the parts of the film where you're on a plantation, that it was a retread or perhaps an exploitation of the brutality of slavery, that we've seen this in films before, that we don't need another staging of the horrors that we see visited upon our characters in this film. And there are some horrible things that happen. But it really kind of brought to my mind just how hard I think it is to contextualize and frame the issue of race and how it's depicted in film, and the issue of history and America's history with race and how it's depicted in film, because so many criticisms were aimed at the film for having for rehashing this brutal depiction of slavery. But at the same time, we were also engaged in a controversy earlier this summer with the film Gone with the Wind, and the fact that it romanticized slavery, and that we should be, art should be more forthcoming and more honest about the realities of what happened in our past, and really of the atrocities that were visited upon people that were brought to this country in bondage and forced into servitude. But I just think it goes to show how it can be so difficult as a filmmaker, as an artist, to do a movie like Antebellum, where if you go too light on slavery, or if you brush over the brutalities of it, then you could get accused of trying to paint the past in a more positive manner than it was. If you go too harsh on the depiction of slavery, you could be accused of exploiting the generational pain. It really just shows me that we are still struggling as a actual society and culture, as a community, an artistic community, on how to talk about issues of race and how to depict issues of race. And I think that this is a film that really brings those questions to the forefront. And so, having said that, I do want to address that particular criticism of the film, and that would involve giving a spoiler for the film. So you've heard my thoughts on Antebellum in general, but I do want to address that one issue. So those are my spoiler-free thoughts. If you want to stick around and hear the spoiler thoughts, and they'll be somewhat brief, but this is the line of demarcation. So spoilers from here on. Final warning, I'm going to talk about the final act of this film. So what I really think is the interesting thing in this dynamic about the depiction of slavery in this film and the brutality of slavery is that we find out in the third act of the film that the portion of the film that we saw first, the first act of the film, actually happens after what we see in the present day sequences. That Vanessa and Eden are the same person, and that Vanessa was kidnapped by a group led by a United States senator who was essentially using private property to recreate the Civil War by kidnapping black people and forcing them back into servitude by literally recreating the circumstances of the Civil War and going back to an era where black people were subjugated and put in chains and made slaves. And so this first act that we thought was perhaps some kind of a flashback or goes back in time is actually happening in today's society, is actually happening in the real world with real life current racists who want to live in a world where black people are in chains. And the thing for me that when we talk about the depictions of slavery and the criticism that we've seen it all before, we have seen depictions similar to what we've seen as far as showing the brutality of the oppression and the ruinous effect that it has. But I think that by putting it in the context of it being current day, to me, that only serves to deepen that portrayal, because instead of viewing it through a historical context of look at how terrible these human beings were treated during the Civil War, we realize that we are seeing the capacity of man to treat human beings this terrible in today's society. And so I think it reframes the brutality of the movie, and it makes the point that there is so much left to do, and there's so much left still that we haven't addressed, and it becomes almost a cautionary tale of backsliding and whatever advances that might have been made could easily be wiped away by a group of people with enough money and power and determination to take people out of today's life and put them back into bondage. So for me, I had that thought when I was watching the first act of the movie. We've seen dramas about slavery, and we've seen the brutality with which African Americans were treated during the Civil War. But by putting it in current day, I think it only becomes almost a warning. It becomes more of an actual horror movie, because it is a horrific thought that there would be people out there motivated to do this kind of a thing in today's world. So I think it recontextualizes everything, the third act of this movie. If you just don't like the twist, or if you don't want to go with the twist, I understand that as well. But that's a criticism that I would love to debate with someone who did not enjoy the film for those reasons, because I think this is a movie that should stimulate discussion and not just judgment one way or the other, because I think it raises some very interesting issues. I wish that it had been done a little more less on the nose. At times it feels a little film schooly. When I say that, I just mean it feels like the directors and writers thought that perhaps this was a very deep connection they were making, when in fact it was a very obvious one. But it's still one that I recommend, just because I think it does stimulate a lot of thought and a lot of discussion. And so I recommend Antebellum. There are many people who do not, but I do think I will be looking forward to seeing even more discourse about this film and seeing where the discussion takes us, because a movie coming out and being reviewed isn't the end of that movie's life. Movies are are discussed and revisited and recontextualized for years after they come out. That's one of the great things about culture and culture around movies. It is alive and thriving and evolving. And it could be that 5 years from now, I will revisit this film and feel completely different based on criticisms that I've heard and discussions that I've read and revisiting my own thoughts. So this was actually a very stimulating film for me intellectually, and it really made me think, and I think perhaps it might make you think as well. Well, those are my thoughts on Antebellum. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see even more reviews and box office charts, you name it, please be sure to join me right here on the channel, or you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. We're doing a lot of fun stuff. We'd love to have you join the film crew over there. But thanks for watching us here on YouTube, and I'll see you next time.